earlier, social movements were analyzed as workers protesting in the context of the industrial setting or in the factories. Uh, the level at which movements were understood or analyzed was at the workers level. That means workers protesting and revolting against the owners of the factories and the establishment. So the worker, or in other words, the class, was taken as a unit of analysis in analyzing earlier social movements and understanding the contribution of groups or collective behavior in the context of bringing about social change in the context of the Industrial Revolution. However, when other movements which began, which included students protesting against the war or demanding free speech rights in the context of universities, this phenomena was relatively new in the understandings of understanding social movements, and this led to the idea of trying to explain this new occurrence in the context of social movements. So the large scale participation of students across many different countries in Europe and in the United States was a departure from the common understanding of social movements, and this required explanation because the existing Marxist frame and theories struggled to explain why students were the central participants in these protest movements or the social movements. So what the earlier movements, they have been called old social movements, and the movements that began in the context of university students against the war, these movements have been identified as new social movements. A very important distinction between these two movements is the old social movements were located in the context of class, or the working class was protesting against the establishment or the industries demanding for fair wages, higher wages, better working conditions. But on the other hand, what the new social movements which emerged were actually protesting for rights or the freedom of speech and protesting against war and asking for more democratic spaces in the context of educational institutions. So what we see is there is a difference between the nature of the old school, the old social movements and the new social movements. Post-materialism is which values individual self-expression and quality of life, which is also embodied in the new social movements. Freedom of speech, environmental movements, gender equality, these all became the primary concern of new social movements. Hence, these movements are generally understood as new social movements. These new social movements emphasize post-materialist thought and are less focused on the idea of redistribution of material goods such as land or capital. These earlier movements, known as old social movements, centered around the issues of the working class. On the other hand, the newer movements addressed issues of caste in the Indian context, gender, ethnicity, and environment, and these movements are collectively known as new social movements. The old social movements were primarily class-based. They were aiming at the reorganization of power located within political parties. As Professor Chaudhary remarks, new social movements, in contrast, were not about changing distribution of power in society, but often about the quality of life issues such as a clean environment, personal choices such as alternative sexualities, expressions of cultural identities, and where they were all non-party based. In the context of new social movements, it became very difficult to classify members belonging to one class or a particular class, because they belonged to diverse backgrounds and classes of people. So therefore, looking at it from the old social movement perspective, which was class centered, the new social movement had diverse groups of people participating in such movements. Some scholars have claimed that a celebration of diverse identities making up the multicultural fabric of West has weakened the place of class as an analytical concept in understanding new social movements or the idea of social movements as such. Professor Chaudhary, on the other hand, argues that the new social movement concern for class inequality and unequal presence of resources are important features of the movements. In the words of Eder, positions on class and its relation to the new social movements, he writes, and I quote, "New social movements are not class movements in the traditional sense, but they manifest a new type of class relationship in which the making of the middle class as a group with a distinct identity and consciousness is dialectically intertwined with the mobilization of new social movements." If we have to compare the features of old social movements and new social movements, we will see that the old social movements were emphasizing on economic redistribution, and this can be seen in the context of workers asking for better wages or redistribution of wages in the context of the workers, or it is better working conditions. It is emphasizing on increased rights of workers and the availability of education and healthcare in the context of the movements that emerged in the context of factories and industries in the 19th century. But whereas if we look at the new social movements were emphasizing the preservation of the environment and the idea of peace that is attached to it. The new social movements were emphasizing on human rights, and also they were addressing rights of alienated workers. If we look at old social movements and the participants, the old social movements, groups advocating for issues that directly benefited members of the group, that means the industrial workers, were the focus of the old social movements. But whereas if we look at the new social movements, the groups or the participants were drawn from a variety of social groups across both international and intersectional boundaries, and they were advocating on behalf of all other collectives or all other groups. In other words, people belonging to different backgrounds, different classes were representing issues concerning larger groups of people. What were the values of old social movements? They were emphasizing security of the workers in the context of factories, and the freedom of consumption and development of material progress. On the other hand, the new social movements were basically post-materialism, or they were post-materialistic in the context of what they were valuing. They were valuing for the freedom of speech and generally the quality of life. The internal structure of old social movements were based on representative associations which were very formal within the context of the factories, and their external structure was primarily using political parties and the people who were ruling, and the whole movement was trying to address the rights of accessing a capital. But whereas if we look at the context of the new social movements, the internal structure of these movements was very, very informal, and they were less hierarchical, and they were more spontaneous because they emerged based on the context of the situation where different members joined, and they would also respond to different contexts depending on where the movement was heading. And the external structure of these protests were basically based on largely negative goals, preventing degradation of the environment or violation of individual rights. It is in this context that we can understand even environmentalism as a new social movement, because new social movements were also talking about the idea of quality of life and also protection of the environment, or talking about prevention of the environment from becoming degraded. So environmentalism is basically another form of an environmental movement, or rather it is another new social movement. Environmentalism emerged as a social and political movement in the 1950s in Western countries like Germany, Sweden and the United States. The publication of the book Silent Spring in 1962 was a seminal work by Rachel Carson, a marine biologist. In this book, she demonstrates the harmful effect of DDT, and this sparked a whole new environmental movement. Her research, alongside others, showed that DDT entered the food chain and accumulated in the fatty tissues of animals and humans, causing genetic damage and cancer too. And this finding resulted in protests and put pressure on the government of the United States to ban DDT, and DDT was banned in 1972 and other countries followed suit, and today DDT is almost universally banned in many countries and its use is completely prohibited. Basically, what we saw is that the findings of Rachel Carson's work sparked a new environmental movement, or what is known as environmentalism, which is asking for the protection of not only the environment but the human intervention and its impact on on life generally. The torchbearers of environmentalism are civil society, in particular individuals and organizations that use media to inform and influence society in defense of the environment, wildlife, the preservation of biodiversity, and fight against global warming and climate change. The central tenet of environmentalism is that environment or nature has to be protected, and environmentalists aim to bring these concerns into the political field. Environmentalism aims to rectify the damages done to the environment and prevent further destruction of the planet and its resources. Environmentalism calls for a change in the way society engages with the environment, wherein the earth's natural resources such as water, air, forests, grasslands or minerals, as well as biodiversity and the ecosystem need to be protected. Basically, what environmentalism aims for is bringing about social change in the way human societies engage with the environment. It aims for social change by promoting society and working to halt deforestation, desertification, greenhouse gases, oil spills, acid rain, global warming, nuclear hazards, and unregulated genetically modified organisms. In other words, what environmentalism aims to do is to bring about an environmental consciousness or concern for the environment amongst the larger society, and thereby bringing about the idea of change and protection for the environment. And this informs the idea of human societies engaging with the environment. In some sense, environmentalism can be viewed as a political ideology because it aims for the protection of the environment, and if this has to be achieved, it has to invoke other ideologies or political movements that may not be directly related to the environment in its essence. In other words, environmentalism has to join hands with other social movements in terms of bringing about awareness, or maybe put pressure on political parties to bring about change in the context of protecting and conserving environmental resources. Environmentalism also piggybacks on anti-globalization, anti-capitalism and anti-Americanism to argue for the place of environment in society and against the destruction of nature and squandering of natural resources in the pursuit of profit. Central to the idea of environmentalism is the idea that the environment is plundered by capitalist intervention, large-scale industrial productions, and therefore globalization is further increasing the idea of the degradation of the environment, and that is why environmentalism stands against these ideas of intervention into the environment and thereby causing its destruction. Furthermore, industries, economic matters, corporations, governments and other personal interests should not place money, profit or power over the environment. Industry, economic matters, corporations, governments and personal interests should not be given priority over nature. In the Western context, environmentalism emerges as a next step after economic affluence. In other words, it is an outcome after the material requirements of society is satisfied, or the standard of living has improved, and the next step or the next logical outcome of this betterment of material conditions is the protection of environment. So in other words, environmentalism in the Western context is an outcome of industrial societies that have a higher standard of living. Seen from this perspective, environmentalism is a product of post-industrial society as an expression of post-material worldview. If we see environmentalism from this perspective, Western society is painted as industrialized, whereas on the other hand, in Indian society is largely agrarian and still has not reached the idea of West attainment of material goods and a standard of living that the West has achieved. Therefore, environmentalism in India takes another trajectory or a path in understanding how society relates to nature. Ramachandra Guha's work on environmentalism in India challenges this very idea of environmentalism in the Western context. What he argues is, in the Indian context, the environmentalism is different because there are many societies and communities whose livelihoods are directly linked with the environment. In the Indian context, poor individuals and communities have continually been fighting to protect the environment, and since they have been depending on the environment, be it forests, grasslands or water bodies, because they have been directly depending on it for their survival, they have been constantly fighting and protecting it. Therefore, in the Indian context, environmentalism has recently emerged or recognized as an important movement. This is because rural, marginalized and Adivasi communities depended on the natural resources for their livelihoods and survival. Their culture is linked to nature. Thereby, the protection and conservation of natural resources is in their community's interest. Hence, the support for and the strength of environmental movement makes sense when communities lose their control and links to land, water, forests, grasslands and other natural landscapes. Another dimension to the rise of environmental movements in India can be traced to the roots of colonialism. The colonial regime enacted laws which controlled or took away resources from rural and Adivasi communities. Many of the social movements by peasants and Adivasi communities were a response to the usurpation of the resources by the colonial rulers. The forceful appropriation of resources threatened the lives of communities in India. Guha points out that the trajectories of environmentalism in the West and India were remarkably different. In the West, the destruction of environment had implication on people's health and the aesthetics of how they look at the surrounding and the ability to pursue outdoor leisure activities. In India, on the other hand, environmental degradation hit at the very source of people's livelihood because it was on these resources that the communities were depending. It is thus that the environmentalism of the poor has a different agenda from the environmentalism of the rich. In order to understand environmentalism and environmental movements in India, Gadgil and Guha suggest that the material, political and ideological aspects need to be considered. The material aspect has resulted in one group gaining from the natural resources at the cost of depriving the poor, and the powerful groups include industrialists, urban consumers and rich farmers, while the powerless groups include the pastoral nomads, peasants, fisher folk whose livelihood depends on the natural resources. It is the latter group that is overwhelming at the receiving end of the deterioration of the environment. The political expression of environmentalism in India has seen the formation of social action groups that have been impacted by the destruction of the environment. The struggles of these groups is largely political in nature, though formal political parties have paid little attention to environmental issues and their implications on the livelihoods of these groups. The struggle by social action groups have laid out an alternative discourse on the path to development in India. The tone and tenor of the alternative path to development argues for a more just society and a more sustainable environment. And this is the ideological expression of the environmental movements in India. So what we find is that in the context of West and the context of India, the environmentalism has different meanings. In one context, it is after the achievement of material growth that the concern for the environment arises, and therefore movements have emerged. But whereas in the Indian context, these social movements or environmentalism has emerged because societies and communities and the poor, their lives have completely dependent on the environment directly. Therefore, these movements emerged for protecting environments because it was also about protecting their own lives and livelihoods.